Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Well, we are indeed in for a very pleasurable, interesting debate about where we will source our energy. You've heard some of the debate and the discussion about some of the global drivers in our energy future. You've heard about climate change and the impact of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions on global warming. Indeed, at a national level, over the last few years and very recently in our federal parliament, most Australians have been exposed to the debate on carbon pricing versus direct action policy as means to direct our energy behaviour. You've also heard about population increase and the demand from much of the world for higher living standards, of course requiring much greater energy consumption. What are the implications for production of our electricity, the transport fuels that we use, and the way we fuel our industries? You've probably heard too a bit about innovations in technology, cleaner versions of existing technologies, or more efficient usage of those technologies, and newer forms such as renewable energy. Some of the renewables, of course, being closer to large-scale use right now than others are. For example, government and regulators tell us that today 28% of the electricity in our state of South Australia comes from wind power and less than 20% from coal, compared to 10 years ago when less than 1% of that energy came from wind power and almost half from coal. So we are changing our energy usage, our patterns of energy, our energy demand, and where we source our energy. So what will our energy future look like? Where will we source our energy in the future? Well, to help us gain insight into this question, we have four eminent presenters here this evening to join us, each with a different perspective. We'll begin with Professor Barry Brook and the notion that it's imperative that climate change and other problems of global sustainability are mitigated over the next few decades, that we need practical solutions that are available now or soon, that those solutions need to effectively displace fossil fuels at a large scale, be economically competitive, and solve many more problems than they create. Barry will talk to us about transforming our energy systems worldwide and the key role that next-generation nuclear power and related techno-fixes must play. Then Professor Gus Nathan will then take us to consideration of potential pathways to a clean energy future. His is the view that the most viable pathway to low carbon intensity must embrace both economic and social sustainability. The view that given the long lifetime and capital-intensive nature of much of our energy infrastructure, a sustainable pathway will necessarily involve a gradual transition of existing energy systems towards cleaner ones. He will concentrate on hybrids between renewable and conventional energy technologies as part of that solution, and we'll talk about opportunities for Australian industry if we go down that path, presenting his thoughts on how we might facilitate the take-up of those opportunities. Next, we will take a look at the bioenergy industry with Associate Professor David Lewis, talking to us about microalgae as a potential renewable energy source. His thesis is that the low-carbon economy provides a unique opportunity to provide some additional impetus for the commercialisation of biofuels. His interest is in microalgae liquid transportation fuels, particularly in the aviation and maritime industries, fuels with properties that might warrant their adoption into the existing fuel supply chain in place of current fossil fuels. And finally, we will hear from the Adelaide Airport's Stephanie Bolt, who will describe the aviation industry's response to global climate change agenda and what are the drivers and opportunities for alternative energy in that industry. So now to the presentation by Professor Barry Brook. Barry is a leading environmental scientist, a professor at this university's Environment Institute, where he holds the Sir Hubert Wilkins Chair of Climate Change. He has published 3 books, 250 refereed scientific papers, and regularly writes popular articles for the media. His awards include the 2006 Australian Academy of Science Fenner Medal and the 2010 Community Science Educator of the Year. His research focuses on the causes and consequences of extinction, analysis of energy systems for carbon mitigation, and simulation models of the synergies of human impacts on the biosphere. His talk is entitled Plentiful Clean Energy for the 21st Century. Please welcome Professor Barry Brook.
Okay, I have 5 minutes to summarise that enormous topic. So how am I possibly going to do that? Well, I hope mostly we'll tease out these issues in the panel discussion that comes after each of us have given our little spiel, but let me hit you with a few of the main points I think are important to appreciate in this broader context. I say plentiful and clean energy because, as Trish mentioned, I think we're going to need a lot more energy because there are a lot of services that we need to replace if we're going to make our human society more sustainable. Services that include relying on undermining nature's capital. If we can avoid doing that, and one way that that is being characterised today in our environmental impacts is in climate change, if we can find alternatives to that, then we can be successful as a species in the long term. So we're going to need more energy, I argue, not less, but it's got to be the right type of energy. People are good at imagining interesting and often nasty futures, and these are 4 scenarios that was invented by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report a few years ago. And some of them involve, nasty men with guns and people sitting around boardrooms deciding on the future. But one of the interesting ones I found was called the Techno Garden, and that envisaged a lot more urbanisation, people heavily relying on technologies to solve environmental problems, and essentially going in a different direction to how many people envisage a clean energy future is, which is more like an adapting mosaic where people focus on small-scale local solutions. But what does that techno garden involve? Well, a whole range of technologies, everything from genetic engineering of crops and large-scale desalination projects, using new technologies to replace our current dependence on oil, potentially growing large amounts of food in vertical greenhouses in cities, all number of technologies which have a shared reliance on a lot of energy in order to make them function properly. Now, where would we get this energy from? Well, there are a lot of potential technologies. History's taught us that a lot of them probably won't work out in the long term, simply because a lot of our good ideas ultimately don't work at a large scale, but some of them will, and these are some of the alternatives, and Gus Nathan and David Lewis are going to talk about a few of those individual examples. I'll focus on the one in the centre, which is next generation nuclear energy. Now, you can evaluate energy sources through a whole range of criteria, And I won't bore you with all of the details here, but there are types of analyses called multi-criteria decision-making analyses, which look at different technologies and how they rank according to things like greenhouse gas emissions or costs, or how dispatchable they are, or how much land they use, whether they produce radioactive waste and so on. And you can provide ranks against these. This is a scientific way of looking at energy, and I would encourage politicians and the general public to try and take more of a scientific approach to this, because it tries to divest as much of the emotion from the topic as possible and look at the hard facts, because we're going to need hard facts and good evidence if we're going to solve these problems on a large scale. Now, when you do that, there are some surprising outcomes, such as nuclear comes out looking pretty good in terms of many sustainability criteria. One of the biggest attractions for nuclear energy to me is it's an incredibly energy dense form of fuel. So there's a person. We imagine they were requiring 100 to 200 kilowatt hours of electricity per day. Now that would be for everything, not just the electricity you use in your house, but the type of energy that would be used to replace oil for your aircraft flights and producing your food in agriculture and so forth. That's actually a lot of energy, about 10 times more than you just use in your house. And you live for 85 years, so you're using it 365 days a year, then you expect to live for over 30,000 days. And you'd require, on that basis, over 6 million kilowatt hours of electricity per person. Now that's sort of a meaningless number in and of itself to most people. But to give you an illustration of what that means in terms of fuel, for uranium, that 6 million kilowatt hours could be contained in a golf ball of uranium. So it's very energy dense. Whereas if you were to do it with coal, like most of us do today, then you would require about 800 elephants worth of coal to do the same job. Now coal's actually a pretty energy dense form of fuel. If you were to store all of that energy in a lithium ion battery or some similar chemical storage technology that we might use today, then you could put it in a lift shaft, and then that lift shaft would be the height of many Burj Khalifa buildings. In fact, 13.2 kilometres high. So that shows how energy dense uranium is and why it's particularly attractive. It also illustrates that storing electricity is actually really difficult in a chemical form. It requires a lot of mass to do it, and therefore it's very expensive. So different technologies are in different stages of the pathway of development to the large scale, diffusing in markets to the extent where they can actually make a real difference. Two of the most mature ones are current generation 3 nuclear power and wind energy. As Trish mentioned, South Australia's done really well in wind development, hasn't done particularly well in nuclear development, but other countries are doing that. But two areas I think are particularly important that I'd probably like to talk about in the panel session are next generation nuclear that recycles nuclear fuel to get all of that energy out of that dense material, and developing better ways to store renewable energy on a large scale. If we can solve those two problems, I think we're headed for a clean energy future that's really viable and economically competitive. Now, this is a forecast from the CSIRO and the Bureau of Resource Economics in Australia, which suggested that if we could pursue these different energy technologies, in the future we really could decarbonise our electricity supply. Most of the coal would be, in that case, replaced by nuclear, but a whole range of the growth and many of the other technologies, especially the dispersed energy, could come from rooftop photovoltaics, geothermal, solar thermal, and a range of hybrid technologies like what Gus is going to talk about in the next talk. So in summary, for my little section, I think we're going to need a lot more energy, and there's no perfect solution. Each of the different technologies have their pros and cons and their supporters and their detractors, but you really need to consider the trade-offs involved in making a decision. You know, what energy source would you choose, and what would you exclude, and why would you do that? If you can't argue why you've ruled something else, especially relative to other options, you're not really being intellectually honest with yourself. But I think at this stage, because we're unsure about what exactly might be the right pathway, we do need to keep all of our options open. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Now I'd like to introduce to you Professor Gus Nathan. Professor Nathan is the founding director of the University of Adelaide Centre for Energy Technology. He is a mechanical engineer and recipient of an ARC Discovery Outstanding Researcher Award. He applies leading research methods spanning laser diagnostics to pilot-scale investigations to support the development of novel clean energy technologies. Gus has worked with a wide range of thermal energy systems, including the combustion of fossil and biofuels, concentrated solar thermal and geothermal energy, and now specialises in their hybridisation. He has published widely, with more than 120 publications in leading journals, 200 in peer review conferences, and 10 patents. Past technology developments include being principal leader of the chief design team for the award-winning fuel and combustion system for the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games, the torch relay, and joint leadership of the development of low nitrous oxide combustion technology in rotary cement kilns. His research specialises in development and application of laser diagnostic methods to complex turbulent reacting flows. His talk this evening is entitled Pathways to a Clean Energy Future. Please welcome Professor Gus Nathan.
Thank you very much, Trish. And thank you all for coming along. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this discussion afterwards because I know in an audience like this there's always a lot of really interesting discussion that comes from the collective experience. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm part of a very large and very wide team, and some of the other contributors to all of this work, which I've been privileged to work with, are listed here. And shown on the picture is, I guess, two of the technologies that are part of, I think, the transition that I'll talk about. Of course, there are many options. There's no one solution that is going to be right for everywhere. That's definitely come out already. I'm sure we're all aware of that. But the hybridisation is one of the pathways which can make a lot of sense in a lot of places. And here we're going to talk about hybridising combustion of, could be fossil fuels or biofuels, with heat generated from the sun. And this is a photograph of a plant I had the privilege to visit around about July this year, just out from Seville in Spain. It looks kind of like the tower is beaming down this amazing energy, but in fact, of course, it's coming the other way. The mirrors reflect all the heat back up, and that is concentrated and can generate heat equally well to what a flame or some other source can do. The challenge, of course, is that the solar radiation is not there all the time, and hence linking them together is what we're going to talk about as one of the options in this transition. So there's a few points I'd like to make, and then I'll give a bit of background, and then we can talk about them later in the discussion. Of course, we all know that sustainability is not only one parameter. We can't only worry about environmental sustainability at no cost. We have to have things that are economically sustainable. We know from the global financial challenges that we've been going through of recent times, there's limited amount of money to address in any one problem. We have to find ways that not only are cost effective, but hopefully can help to drive the economy forward, and that's what I'm going to talk about. As well as, of course, it has to have social engagement, and we have to have community buy-in for whatever technology is adopted. But in energy, the transition is inevitably slow, and that's because most of the existing infrastructure, of course, there is a growing amount of smaller domestic infrastructure through panels, etc. But nevertheless, a key part of our existing technology, and what will probably be also a key part of the transition for many years, is large-scale infrastructure. And the reason we have large-scale infrastructure is not just because it supports monopolies, but because it actually makes engineering sense. Thermal energy systems become more efficient as they get bigger. There's a lot of economies of scale in economics as systems get bigger. So there's been a trend in any industrial process, or any of the ones that involve thermal plants in particular. Most of them get bigger with time. And so because of that, they're also very expensive, and industry becomes risk averse, and these plants will typically have life of 30 years, so you don't just want to shut it down because you don't like it anymore. If it's going to, they will try and find ways to get the most out of the infrastructure that is there. So this means the timescale for turning over energy infrastructure is inevitably long. Of course, there are costs and opportunities, and Barry presented some of the typical the costs and some of the multidimensional components of some of the different technologies that have been compared. But we also need to think about investment. We know that we can invest in different technologies, and some have got a greater return on the investment because there can be income generated through that technology pathway. And so within that, as a society, we can look at some nations. Typical examples include places like Germany that have invested in, for example, renewable energy, but not only in installing it in their own country, but in developing the capability to export that technology and the know-how, and from that have had a big return on their investment in the flow-on jobs through the economy. So it's important for us as a society to think, if we're going to be putting in investments into our clean energy system, how can our country get the best return in the types of technologies we'll invest in supporting and developing? And of course, that's part of our society, part of university, our industry. We have to find ways that we can be part of driving those opportunities forwards. And of course, preferred solutions are not universal. There are local situations. The context is different in every place. Some countries, some locations have got more of one resource than another. Some have got different energy networks. We've all got unique situations. So there's no solution that's going to be ideal everywhere. And there's also a wide diversity of technologies, and Barry again presented some of those. But this also means that as a location here in South Australia, and the same in every other place for their own context, there are particular situations that may make more economic sense to do here than anywhere else in the world. And if we can identify what those situations are and invest in those, that gives us an opportunity as a nation or as a region to establish first mover advantage, and therefore then export that technology and that capability within the global market and the global economy. So that's really critical to how we are going as a nation to think not only about the cost of clean energy, but about the value. And within that, of course, we're also part of a global world. We've got global industry as well as local. We've got to find ways of linking the local, the global, the regional industry and economy together so that we can be part of the global chain and finding out where we can invest most effectively to be part of this transition, which can implement technologies here but then export them and participate in this global chain. And whilst there are many technologies, it's important to note that global investment in renewable energy is extremely large. And in fact, generally, so on this figure you can see plotted the global investment in $1 billion per annum in renewable energy, both in the developed economy and in the developing economy. And generally, the global growth in energy internationally, what we find is that renewables are now growing fastest in the OECD, and presently in the non-OECD, fossil fuels are growing fastest. And typically most of the projections from groups like the International Energy Agency and the like are predicting that in the next 30 years, the biggest growth in total energy demand is going to come from the non-OECD countries such as China and India and Indonesia and the like. And most of those will be are expected to rely on fossil fuels for the majority of that total growth. On the other hand, in terms of within the OECD countries, we're expecting predominantly a transition. There'll be some growth in total energy, but most of it will be a change in the mix. So the biggest growth in new energy type in the OECD countries is expected to come from renewables. And renewables is presently the fastest growing type of energy in the OECD, and is also presently globally accounts for 22% of total energy. So it's no longer small. Presently the biggest of that is still from hydro, but the non-hydro renewables intermittents are expected to be biggest by about 2020. So the growth in renewables is happening around the world. It's happening fast, and it's driven by these different components, because the more they get developed, of course, as we all learn by doing things, the costs come down, and so all of the costs of renewables are coming down. Of course, they still do remain expensive, and the costs vary a lot from place to place, and they also vary from location to location. So typically they're driven by particular, for example, in photovoltaic was originally driven in the completely off-grid situations, and then they move into the more next marginal, and then they, etc., etc. There are locations and niches where they become most economic, and that drives the cost down. But there's also energy security is a big part. For example, in Australia, we are projected to lower our fraction of liquid transport fuels. And every country has a need for liquid transport fuels for security. That's a big driver for investment. That'll be picked up a bit more by David and by Steph, I'm sure, as they talk about the need for liquid transport fuels. But there are many ways to contribute to those, which also include things like solar thermal, which may come up in the discussion. Another driver is CO2 mitigation, of course. We're all very aware of that, but also international competitiveness. Because of this, the big business opportunity, then there's lots of drivers for investing in this renewable energy sector. Of course, that is going forward and is growing, but there are challenges. And the biggest challenge of the growing part of renewables, of course, hydro is pretty much very much a limited resource. If you happen to have the opportunity for it, then it's got a lot of advantages. But of course, in places like South Australia, we know the opportunities are very small. And the key challenge with renewables is what is well illustrated in this figure, where we see the dark blue line is the daily cycle of electricity demand. Every peak is a daily from mid-afternoon summer peak to the nighttime trough, and this is a typical period in summer in South Australia. So you've got a daily demand up and down in electricity, and then the purple line is the time trace of when the wind is available. And you can see the wind occasionally happens to line, the peak on the wind availability might match the peak in demand, but many of the times it might be completely out of correlation or might not be there at all. And this is the challenge, is that renewable resources, if you just look at how much they cost, is only a very, very small part of the equation. We have to look about, if you're just integrating a very small part of it into the network, it's no big issue. But as you try and integrate it to a larger extent, you've got to look at how that impacts on the rest of the system. And of course, we're developing ways of doing that. I know that I visited several, or heard several presentations some 10 years ago where they said the maximum amount of wind that could be integrated into a grid was about 10%. But of course, as we've already heard from Trish, we're already up to around 28% in South Australia, for example. So that is changing, but it impacts on the grid. So that means, for example, if the wind goes up and down, presently we have to have combustion plants on standby, and they all impact each other. Of course, longer term, there are many components to the solution, including things like better demand management. There's no single part of the mix. But how we manage this is the key challenge over the next 10, 20 years in particular. And Barry already mentioned the issue for storage, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. So the other real issue apart from storage is one where we talk about hybrids. And this is a diagram which illustrates what we mean by a hybrid system. So a typical thermal power plant, the one that we have in Torrens Island, which is like this, is a gas boiler. Similar principle if we have a gas turbine like at Pelican Point or other places. Effectively, what we need is a source of heat, and the heat we use to pressurise the steam or give it energy, and then on the other end we need something to take the heat away, the condenser or the cooling system. And that temperature differential combined with a pump allows us to extract energy from the turbine. The same broad principles apply whether we're talking about gas turbines. Of course, there's a lot of details with combined cycles, etc., but nevertheless, they all require this principle. Now, when we think environmentally, we might think that fossil fuels and solar are completely opposite ends of the spectrum. But on the picture on the top right, what we're looking at is a solar concentrator, a different type, and these also generate heat like the first photograph I showed. They're both sources of heat. And from an engineering perspective, we can integrate them into the one system. And if we do that effectively, then what we can do is we can have one system that doesn't turn up and down with availability of the resource, but we keep that going. And of course, there are other ways, increasingly, where we can also integrate storage into these systems as well, so that we can go from, for example, the plant which is being built in Cogan Creek in Queensland at the moment is around about 3% of the total energy comes from solar with this kind of hybrid. But some of the next generation hybrids that we're working on could achieve up to something like 60% of a solar share. So this transition means that we can lower the carbon footprint, but we can do it with less total infrastructure. You can see that if we build a hybrid plant, we can share the turbine. We don't have to have one turbine in a combustion plant, another one in a solar plant. We can share the turbine, we can share the condenser. And the next generation of hybrids will look at totally integrating and sharing all the infrastructure, which can lower the costs. So the last slide is, I think part of the pathway to our transition is to look for the synergies. The synergies not only in technologies, but the synergies between cleaner energy and economic growth. Of course, we can choose technology options that can cost money. Everything will have some cost requirement, but if we can choose ones that give a payback, we can try and identify synergy and economic growth. And that involves participating in the global technology innovation chain. We can't only be people who buy in technology, we have to be part of developing. We have to work out what technologies make the most sense to develop and or implement or adapt for our local situation to extract value, and then from that learning to export that capability around the country and around the world. So being part of both the development chain and then the exporting. And of course that requires fostering clusters of local and global partners, both in industry, looking at big multinational industry in the supply, but also smaller local SMEs, and also in our research, local research expertise linking with national and international partners. And at the University of Adelaide, we have a research park at Thebarton already, and we're developing our plans to expand this in exactly this line. Then a couple of examples of some of the technologies we're working on at the university here to participate in this, precisely in this synergy. One of them is in these next generation of hybrids, where there's a whole suite of them we're working on. One of them is in hybrids for combining the power generation for a hybrid between the receiver and combustor. Another is another technology which is looking at chemical looping, I won't go into now. And the third one is in another part of the liquid fuels chain, where we're using concentrated solar to bring into the cold liquids or the coal biomass to liquids route to lower the cost of these routes, and also bring in the increasingly large solar fraction. And as you bring in these, grow the market, then the costs for the solar technologies come down, and so we move down along this transition. And the other is in energy storage, and again at the university we have a big program in energy storage, particularly looking at technologies that can testing the current technologies now. There are a whole family of energy storage technologies, and working in partnership with industry to look at how these can be applied and implemented. So, thank you.
Thank you, Gus. Next, I'd like to introduce Associate Professor David Lewis. David is a chemical engineer and academic at this university. In fact, he came to this university as an undergraduate, as a mature age undergraduate in 1993, whilst employed as an electrical fitter mechanic in the mining and aviation industries. He then went on to do a PhD, focusing on the control of blue-green algae in drinking water and drinking supply reservoirs. He then became a lecturer in 2002 and set up the microalgal engineering research group with a research focus on sustainable technologies exploiting microalgae. That group is developing industrial scale harvesting, dewatering, extraction and biomass to fuel conversion processes. Through a joint project with Murdoch University, a pilot plant located at Karratha, Western Australia, was established, and that plant was used for research and development to commercialise the production of microalgae for renewable energy, in particular biofuel. The pilot plant is now owned and operated by a joint venture company, Muradel, for which David is currently employed as the Chief Technology Officer. Muradel Australia is currently building a fully integrated industry-scale demonstration plant in Whyalla, South Australia, to produce green crude from marine microalgae. David's talk is entitled Low Carbon Processes for Biofuel Production from Microalgae. Please welcome David.
So thank you, Trish, for that kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to the community. So I'm very thankful that everybody's come along to listen to our talks. So, as Trish said, I'm going to talk about low carbon processes to produce biofuel from microalgae. I was with an American yesterday, and I might say algae a few times in my talk. I get confused, algae or algae. Anyway, so my group's been working for the last 6 years on trying to overcome all the challenges of converting algal biomass into crude oil. We established a company, Muradel, in 2010. And several projects have produced a lot of IP, which is now owned by Muradel. And as Trish mentioned, we're building our demonstration plant in Whyalla. And this will be opened officially next April, but we'll start running the plant in January 2014. I was a bit disappointed to see on Barry's scale that biomass scored a 6. So hopefully after my talk, we might be able to drop that number a bit. Okay, so I would like to talk about the challenges that we're slowly overcoming towards producing renewable crude oil sustainably and economically. So when will biomass carbon become competitive? There's really 3 parameters we have to consider. The obvious one is economics. The second one is what we call the energy return on the energy invested ratio. So basically we want our fuels to be energy positive. And the last one is the greenhouse footprint. It's how much carbon we're actually producing by producing crude oil from algae. So as this slide shows you, that it's becoming more energy intensive to access crude oil. So in the 30s, we would use energy equivalent in 1 barrel of crude to produce about 100 barrels of crude. 2011, that ratio was down to 1 barrel of crude of energy to produce 14. And very quickly that's reducing even less. It's about 6 barrels now from 1 barrel of crude. So the crude oil is becoming very expensive to access. So we're drilling deeper than we've ever done before. So we're going over 10,000 metres into the ground to find crude oil. We're getting crude oil from tar sands, and we're fracking. So there's lots of expensive technologies we now need to use to produce crude oil. So by this chart, crude oil is still energy positive. What it doesn't show you is how much energy we need to use to refine that crude into fuel products. And indeed, many of the fuels we use are energy negative. So actually they produce less energy than we need to make that fuel. There's a company in the US called Propel Energy, and they did a survey on biofuels. So they set up a petrol station in Sacramento in California, and they had a range of biofuels for sale, including microalgae biodiesel. They set the price, so all the fuels were the same price as their fossil equivalents, and surveyed the market to see what people would do when they had the option to buy a biofuel or a fossil fuel. And overwhelmingly, the public want biofuels. So they were very happy to be able to buy their fuel, which they felt was renewable and sustainable. They weren't interested in paying more for it though. So they would only buy it if it was the same price, which is fair enough. This particular petrol station, the public who were using it were driving long distances to go especially to that petrol station for the renewable fuel. So it was an outstanding success, but we learned a lot. We have to do it for the same price. So we have to consider the energy ratio, the carbon footprint, and the cost. So we've mentioned briefly our company, Muradel. So we have been looking at the challenges of producing fuel from algae. We started in 2007 and very quickly got some money together and built our plant at Karratha. And that's shown here. This picture here is our 200 square metre ponds. This part no longer exists. We outgrew it, so we achieved all our aims at that plant. But we found working at Karratha was very expensive, so we've decided, as we're still R&D, to relocate to Whyalla, which is much more cost effective for us to continue developing our technology. So what we've learned is how to grow algae continuously. So we're now very comfortable that we have the know-how to continuously grow algae in open pond systems. So we can harvest up to daily from our ponds in the summer and about every 3 days in the winter. But we have continuous growth throughout the year through all the seasonal changes. We have a very special type of algae. It's called Tetraselmis. It's very common in the marine environment. It's everywhere in the world. Our particular strains are halo-tolerant, which means they are quite happy with increasing salinity. So we use seawater in our ponds, and with evaporation the salinity increases, but the algae still grows. And will cope with about 4 times the salinity of seawater. After that, they start to slow down in their production. So we've overcome the production hurdle. And the next problem was trying to harvest the algae. And this was a huge barrier and has slowed down the industry developing because people don't know how to harvest and concentrate the algae cost effectively. We've developed our own system called electroflocculation and trialled it at Karratha. This is about a 3,000 litre tank, and it's very energy efficient and cost effective. The reason why it works so well is because we use saline water. It's highly conductive. So using an electrokinetic process is very efficient for this particular application. And the third challenge was, what do you convert the biomass into? When we started in 2008, we were interested in biodiesel, but we quickly realized it was very difficult to produce biodiesel from microalgal lipids, the oil in the algae. The problem is that the Tetraselmis cell is very small. It's about 10 to 20 microns in diameter, has a very tough cell wall. So to get the oil out of the algae, we have to break open the cell, and that needs an enormous amount of energy. So we found that the biodiesel we produced had a larger carbon footprint than fossil diesel. So it really was a no-brainer not to continue with that. And I'm astounded that there's still companies around the world talking about biodiesel from algae. It won't work. It's too energy intensive. However, there's a technology called hydrothermal liquefaction. And what we do here is basically mimic nature. So we're able to take the biomass, put it under extreme conditions, high temperature, 350 degrees Celsius, high pressure, about 20 megapascals, for a couple of minutes. And in that short time, the biomass, all the protein, the carbohydrate, and the lipid convert to hydrocarbons. It's the most stable form for those components at those conditions. So we can drive that reaction forwards by removing the CO2 gas produced and produce hydrocarbon. And indeed, that's what the source of our current fossil fuel is from, fossil crude. It's from algae that grew millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years, and has been trapped underneath sedimentary rock at high pressure temperature for a long time. So it's produced hydrocarbon. So the challenge for us is to demonstrate our technologies at the commercial scale. We've got involved in the food versus fuel debate, and I believe we'll talk a bit about that in our panel. But because we're using seawater, and we just need the sun, we can use non-arable land. So indeed, Australia is blessed with lots of non-arable land that we can exploit for fuel. Seawater, it's not infinite, but there's a lot of it. So we're not competing by using fresh water in our process at all, and we can use what I've termed in inverted commas, waste nutrients. I think the word waste is a word we should stop using in the 21st century. It's not really waste, it's a resource. We've got to look at waste streams as resource streams, and how can we recycle those streams into our processes. So we can use CO2, we can use nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, the farmers are a bit nervous about the burgeoning algae fuel industry because of the nutrients, the cost of fertiliser. They're worried that if we start producing algae at massive scale, we're going to be pushing the price up of fertilisers. So that's a valid concern. So we're very actively looking at where can we source renewable nutrients. And the obvious place is wastewater. So yesterday I met with Melbourne Water, and their nutrient load at their Werribee plant is probably enough nutrient there to produce 200,000 barrels of oil per year. So that's a great place to start, is a sewage treatment plant to get those nutrients. I mentioned the energy ratio. So algae typically has about 25 megajoules of energy in it in 1 kilo. It's a bit lower than coal by weight, but it's pretty high energy. And obviously we need to grow the algae, convert it to fuel, for less energy than 25 megajoules per kilo to be energy positive. Our harvesting, we use about 0.6 megajoules per kilogram. And the conversion process, so the reactor that we use at 350C and 20 megapascals only uses 8 megajoules per kilogram. The production, because we're in very large ponds, the energy for mixing those ponds is negligible, and we are now working on the challenge of extraction and refining the oil. So we're actually producing distillates from our crude oil, but we haven't yet done our energy balance. And the last point on this slide is the massive scale which is required. So I mentioned Werribee has enough nutrients for 200,000 barrels of oil. I think mankind burn about 3,000 barrels of oil a second. So we're not going to replace fossil fuel with crude oil derived from algae, but we'll definitely have an impact. So finally, I'd just like to introduce you to our product. So this is our crude oil. I had a meeting with the US Pacific Command, who were very interested in buying fossil fuel from Australia for 2016. They're having the Great Green Fleet is going to sail around the world. So that's the US Navy, and they want to run it on 50% biofuel. It's a great idea, but they find it difficult where to access the biofuel. So I was telling them about our biofuels, and they said, oh, we're a bit concerned that they haven't been tested. I said, of course they've been tested. We're producing crude oil. It's the same. So this chart here shows you the boiling point curve. So the black line is the boiling point curve for West Texas Intermediate crude. It's quite a common crude. And overlaid on that is our boiling point curve for a crude oil derived from tetraselmis. And it's almost identical. So basically, this is what crude oil would look like if we heat it up and look at the vapors being produced. And that's what enters an oil refinery. And then we produce the distillates from these fractions. So we looked at the algae oil, and we've got petrol, jet fuel, diesel, and bunker fuel. So all of these fuels can be easily produced from algae biocrude. Finally, I'd like just to wrap up now But just to say that the challenge for Muriel in 2014 is to demonstrate that we can produce this crude oil, convert it into fuel, make the fuel energy positive, and be economical. So that's the challenge for 2014 for our company. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, David. We now come to our final presentation for the evening, Ms. Stephanie Bolt. For the last 8 years, Stephanie has been the Environmental Manager at Adelaide Airport Limited. She's been responsible for overseeing the company's sustainability, environmental and compliance and wildlife management programs. Prior to that, she was Senior Environmental Advisor at Zinifex, now Nearsta smelter in Port Pirie, and spent many years in various environmental and natural resource management consulting roles in Australia and in Singapore. She holds a Bachelor of Agricultural Science with honours from this university and is currently undertaking a Masters in Science, Sustainable Aviation with UK's Manchester Metropolitan University. Her discussion and presentation for this evening is entitled Alternative Energy in Aviation. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks very much, Trish, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for coming today. I will offer a brief apology. I am waging a war against bronchitis at the moment. It's rare to be in an auditorium like this and the only person with an annoying cough is the speaker, but please wish me luck to get through this brief talk. First of all, just to quickly introduce Adelaide Airport Limited. We are an airport lessee company. We operate 2 airports, Adelaide Airport, whom you'll be more than familiar with, and also, for those that are not so familiar, with Parafield Airport, which is one of the busiest training airports for pilots in Australia. We are owned by a number of super companies and a couple of other private investors. We are an airport lessee company. We do not own the airport outright. We have a lease with the Commonwealth Government, who retains the actual ownership of the land and ultimately the assets for a 50-year period with an option to extend for 49 years. And as of the 12-13 year, we recorded a record 7.3 million passenger throughput with just over 100,000 flight movements. So that's us, but what about the aviation industry more broadly? We are part of a rapidly expanding industry, particularly in Asia Pacific, and this is largely on the back of an expanding middle class across Asia Pacific, somewhat in South America and to a lesser degree in Africa. According to the industry peak body, IATA, airlines are predicted to need an extra 34,000 new aircraft between 2011 and 2031. As you can see by that chart, less than half of those are to replace older aircraft. The old Boeing 747s is a classic example. And indeed, the green area there is just purely for growth to carry the additional passenger loads that are going to be needed across the globe. So, however, if you believe Alan Joyce and you believe Qantas and you believe some other CEOs of large airlines, it is a tough industry. And this is, again, a worldwide snapshot. This is averaged across all the airlines that exist. And you can see for yourself there that if on the particular year the line is blue, then overall aviation's made a profit, or airlines have made a profit. If it's red, they haven't. So the average profit margin over the period of 1990 to 2012 is actually 0%. Their margins are very slim and it's very capital intensive. A few years ago, the peak industry aviation bodies got together and realised that they had to participate in the whole climate change debate and recognise the challenges of a carbon-constrained future. They developed some goals, they agreed on some goals, notably that they would commit to carbon-neutral growth from 2020. So acknowledging that they were not interested in constraining growth, however, they would do so on a carbon neutral basis, as you can see by the green line. So as the industry grows, we will expect as an industry to not emit any more CO2 equivalent from that year onwards. And in fact, the industry has ambitiously sought a commitment to reduce its carbon output by 50% by 2050. From the slides you've seen earlier, there is substantial challenges in that, and there is no doubt that the airline industry itself will be seeking a great deal of partnership, and is already doing so, with other private industries, even, of course, the oil industry, the fuel industry, and indeed government, to fund some of the infrastructure changes that are needed to make this a reality. So what are the main drivers? Well, I've already been alluding to them. For simplicity, I've split, I suppose, the aviation industry as a whole into three basic groups: airports, airlines, and then in the middle, allied industries. And they are quite a diverse range of businesses, including catering companies, ground service equipment companies, maintenance providers, busing, ground transport companies, and the like. Now, we're all in this sort of symbiotic relationship, and we all have an interest, of course, in driving the uptake of alternative energy. But what's behind it? Well, obviously, long-term viability. If we're going to support this growing demand for air travel, we will need to take part in the search for an alternative energy solutions. If we want to ultimately reduce cost, if we assume that oil, jet fuel prices are going to rise, that's also a consideration. For a lot of airlines, it's also some market advantage. They certainly try and shoulder each other out the way to get the most green image. And ultimately, what we refer to as a licence to operate. And that's a slightly lesser consideration to actual long-term viability, having enough fuel to actually put in your aircraft. However, if you look at certain areas around England and around Europe, there is an increasing amount of community action that is targeted at aviation. Aviation is seen as a little bit of I think, an easy target to express any particular concerns about climate change, and there is certainly a growing movement to restrict aviation's growth. So if aviation is to secure the confidence of the community surrounding its airports, and just more generally, it needs to demonstrate that it's committed to doing the right thing, and stepping alongside governments and other large businesses along the green path. So this is a really quick snapshot. As you can tell, I'm not a chemist, industrial chemist. I don't have the expertise of the other three speakers before me, but I can provide from my understanding and my reading and research and networks through this industry what some of the alternatives are and what some of the alternatives aren't, more to the point. If you to look at airports and allied industries, there's really a lot that's similar. Renewables stands as one of the most well-used, adopted alternative energies. Stationary energy like wind turbines and solar thermal and solar PV are well used by airports and some of those allied industries. Biodiesel in our airport fleets and similarly in other private airport related fleets has also been substantial uptake and will increase. Hydrogen is emerging, particularly for ground transport like buses, passenger busing, other ground transport, ground service equipment, and when I say that, there are pallet loaders, the pieces of equipment that you use on aprons to load freight in and out of aircraft. I put nuclear there, that's a bit of a tease, but it's a bit of a nod to Barry Brook, that airports are generally large pieces of infrastructure that have a large energy demand, but also a lot of space. And big question mark. Certainly, you won't see it in the future plans of airports around the world at present, but it is realistically an alternative in the long term. For airlines, I talk about biofuels, and when I talk about biofuels, I talk about second generation biofuels, or those that use feedstocks, as has been referred to already, that do not compete with food crops, that do not compete for that space. Almost every major airline, or any airline worth their salt, is certainly active in that space and in researching and trialling and actually now regularly using biofuels for some of their flights. Ethanol, of course, depending on where you sit in the whole biofuel debate, is technically, of course, a biofuel. You can generate it from sugarcane, and then there are processes you can use to convert biofuel, what's called alcohol to jet. And you can blend that with other forms of fuels to create a viable jet A1 type of fuel. It hasn't. Let me just clarify that the second generation biofuels I referred to at the top, that's actually received what's called approval under the American standards to actually be used. So that's why it's actually been, from 2011, could be used regularly and routinely by airlines, because it has been given the stamp. Because these fuels are proven to contain all the right properties, the flash point and all those right properties that are consistent with fossil-derived fuels. However, the ethanol-derived fuels, I believe, have not yet, but they're anticipating that will happen next year, is my understanding. The other are kind of a bit more fanciful, but interesting. Hydrogen, they've played on and off with the idea of hydrogen. Hydrogen requires different types of aircraft or airframe design, what they call, so different shapes of aircraft. You can't put hydrogen in the wings. It has very different properties, as you can imagine. It needs to be under pressure. It has different density. It apparently, on paper, can work, but when you talk about an aircraft having an average life of 25 to 30 years, and then you need, if you wanted to actually design a completely new aircraft to accommodate a completely new fuel, you're looking at a lead-in time of another probably 20 years, so it would take 50 years from today pretty much to see an actual commercial aircraft out on the apron using hydrogen. Nuclear, and when I say nuclear, please don't think that, well, some people have in fact thought about a nuclear reactor on an aircraft. It has been considered, has been toyed with. The radiation issues are real. Then you throw on that the new sort of security concerns around aviation, and it really isn't going to literally fly, I don't think. But they're talking about using nuclear power, of course, to create and develop some of these fuels. So you can create a lower carbon fuel, because some, as you've heard today, creating biofuels can be energy intensive. Electric seems to be feasible for smaller aircraft, certainly not for commercial flight. In short, there's plenty of challenges for the industry to adopt. We're certainly, as overall, on adopting a front foot position, I believe, but it certainly can't be done without a lot of help with other industries and certainly government support. But I think there's still a lot to be optimistic about. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I invite all our presenters to the podium, so to speak, and I'll open up our session to questions. Sir, your question.
Hi there. I've actually got two issues that I was thinking about during this talk.
Sure.
One of which is a concern and one of which is just a matter of interest to me. The concern is that as a medical graduate, I'm terribly aware that sometime during the last 12 months or so, the World Health Organization classified the carcinogens in diesel fuel as dangerous as asbestos. And that's been greeted by total silence by government, commercial interests, and even the unions who are supposed to be protecting their members. My concern there is about the biodiesel. I guess burning any complex hydrocarbons still carries that risk. My other interest was the Barry Brooks's area, and that is the potential future role of laser stimulation of thorium as a sub-fission form of energy generation.
Who'd like to go first? David, perhaps.
Yep. Thank you. It's an interesting question. Carcinogens in diesel. It is well known that there definitely are carcinogens in diesel. As a company, we're not really considering that aspect of the fuel, to be brutally honest. I was asked a question too about the people who sniff fuels. Same sort of problem. You know, these fuels do have dangers to society, but to be honest, we're not considering that in our push to make these fuels economically viable. But it is a real concern.
Barry.
One which is bigger than Muradel, I think.
Barry.
The gentleman asked about thorium. Thorium's another alternative nuclear fuel apart from uranium. Unlike uranium, it isn't used in traditional reactors because you can't enrich thorium. But if you recycle the nuclear fuel that comes out of a nuclear reactor and do that many times, then you can eventually use that thorium in such a way that it's converted into uranium through nuclear transmutation and then burnt in a reactor. And that way, thorium, like uranium, can be a virtually inexhaustible energy source. So if we start to recycle uranium to get all of that energy out of that golf ball's worth of uranium, then we can do the same with thorium as well, and it opens up another fuel source for us.
On that topic, perhaps, when we do look at the task ahead for our energy future, we know that we need to meet our future energy requirement. We want solutions that are environmentally sustainable and responsible, and we'd like to perhaps garner some economic development out of the solutions of the future. What else or other criteria really should we be placing on ourselves as we design that energy future and make choices about the mix of and the source of our energy? Barry.
If I might start, two critical criteria, I think, are whether the alternatives are able to replace our current use of fossil fuels. So David talked about an alternative to oil. That's great, we need those. And Gus talked about using solar in an integrated way with coal in order to reduce the emissions from that coal. You know, they're both practical alternatives, near-term alternatives to fossil fuels. And if we're concerned about things like climate change and other pollution impacts, that's what we need. We can't imagine just technologies that will be available in 20 or 50 years' time. We need to look at how we can find those replacements today. And that's why I also argue for nuclear technology, because we know it's been the most effective historical alternative to coal in many economies.
Gus, one of the things that didn't rate much of a mention was tidal power. Where do you see tidal power in the mix into our future energy?
Yes, well, tidal and wave power are both on the very rapid rise of growth rate. They're, if you like to think of them as a technology medium, they're probably at a similar place to where solar PV panels were 15 or 20 years ago. So tidal wave, tidal you can think of as being like a big wind turbine that's sitting in the water, and then the movement of the water turns it, whereas wave technology are ones that tend to move up and down. The tidal is the one which, where it's available, tends to be most economically viable, but there's less of it, whereas the wave power, there's a lot more of it in the long term. So the key, we've known how to do it in principle for a long time. The challenge is making it economically viable, particularly because these systems can be subject, as we all know, to very large storms, and therefore you've got to design for the extreme event, which makes them much more expensive. However, the technologies have been developing rapidly, as a couple of companies in Australia including Carnegie in Western Australia and Ocean Links in Sydney, who are building a demonstration unit down in the southeast of South Australia. So the technology is definitely growing rapidly, and I think it's one of the ones that is an opportunity to participate in the development phase of. Every technology is going to have a niche for a period, but there'll be locations where they're most viable, and then over time they can be expected to grow.
A question from the audience.
Yes, the issue of liquid fuel seems to be particularly vexed, which we use for transport principally. Many people have written that air transport has no future at all. Many respected experts based on that. It seems as though we have already passed the peak of conventional oil around about 2006, and it looks as though from your own figures that the energy return on energy investment is getting lower and lower and lower. Looking at your figures also, I would suspect that the development of biodiesel from algal sources will not be able to supply the needs of an expanded aviation industry, plus all the other transport needs that we currently have. And I wonder whether the panel would reflect on, therefore, the urgent need to electrify as far as we can our transport system. In other words, we should build high-speed electric rail systems between all our capital cities. We should, as far as possible, try and electrify all the public transport systems in our cities, recognising also that probably the private car doesn't have a great deal of future. And then that makes the energy outlook for the future look far more reasonable, because we do have the technologies, which we've mentioned tonight, for generating electricity increasingly from renewable sources.
I'll come to the rest of the panel, but a few comments firstly from Stephanie.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm aware of the very passionate debate that is continuing globally about aviation and its future. One of the studies that was conducted by Qantas in conjunction with Shell, amongst others, found that one of the main barriers to widespread development of jet fuels from feedstocks and biofuel feedstocks is the competition with biodiesel, and that at the moment governments incentivise biodiesel but don't incentivise biojet fuels. My personal opinion is I tend to agree that competition is not sustainable. We will need to electrify our ground transport quite rapidly to provide aviation with the market share of the biofuel products that are needed to accommodate the growth that's expected.
Thank you, David. I might turn to you. There was a little bit of a mention of the food versus fuel debate, and certainly in the hydrocarbons industry, we've seen groups like Lock the Gate come up with concern about the land use conflict between farming and, in that case, hydrocarbons and mining in the oil and gas industry. Do you want to comment a little bit further on that, the competing interests, I guess, between food and fuel?
Sure.
As it applies to your work?
So that's been a big concern of ours, is that our burgeoning company doesn't be branded as that it's competing with food by producing fuel. As I mentioned, the nutrient demand of algae is high. So you need a lot of nutrient, fertiliser, nitrogen and phosphorus, to grow the biomass. And as I mentioned too, that the farming bodies are very concerned about us this industry, pushing the price up. So like Barry was mentioning about recycling thorium, we need to recycle all of our nutrients. So that's one part of our technology development, which is a big challenge next year, is to see how we can recycle the NMP from the biomass. So we remove the carbon in the form of hydrocarbon and recycle the nitrogen and phosphorus. The land issue in Australia isn't so much of an issue because of the non-arable nature of a lot of our land, but it's a big issue in other countries. So this is a big debate in Asian countries and the US, with algal plants taking up vast areas of land to produce fuels, which is directly competing with food. It's interesting to note that the biodiesel industry in Europe is obviously decimating the rainforests in Indonesia because all the farmers are putting palm plantations in to produce the palm oil to supply the biodiesel needs. And what that's doing is actually making the cosmetic industry suffer, believe it or not, because a lot of their feed stocks come from palm oil, which is becoming more expensive. So now the cosmetic industry is looking at the algae industry to supply those oils they need for lipstick and things like this. So it's a very complicated debate.
Very interesting. We've got a question down the front here. Sir.
Yes, Professor Lewis, can I ask, given the difficulty you drew attention to of liberating the hydrocarbon from the algae, what research is being done on genetically modifying the algae so that the quantity of energy required to liberate it, so that it can then be more efficiently extracted, thereby enabling a greater yield of available energy for other purposes than that of the internal process of winning it?
Very interesting question.
It's a very good question. So indeed, there are many groups looking at genetically modifying algae. One of the concepts is to milk the algae, so just continuously remove the oil whilst the algae is in its growth phase. The problem we have in Australia is we can't release genetically modified organisms into the environment. And because of the scale of production you need...
make it more vulnerable. It wouldn't create a problem and become a weed if it was modified to make it weaker in its structure.
Oh, of course, there are definitely solutions to make it safe, but the trouble is the regulatory bodies won't let us grow these crops in the environment. Yeah. So there is a company in the States called Algenol, and they have got a genetically modified organism, and they're producing ethanol from it. So it's a cyanobacteria, and they milk ethanol from that organism. That's grown in photobioreactors. So even though it works, I can't get my head around their economics, so I can't see how it would make money having these very large photobioreactors. But indeed, there are many groups looking at modifying the organisms. But I must reiterate that we are no longer looking to extract our lipids. We do a whole biomass conversion with hydrothermal liquefaction, which produces the bio-crude. So we're no longer looking at biodiesel. We're interested in producing crude oil. And so we don't have to, for that product, lyse the cell wall.
I think we've got time for perhaps one more question. Gentleman in the middle there.
Our speakers this evening have been focusing on replacement for existing fossil fuels, but also entertaining growth in energy demand. So I've got a couple of questions, one for Barry and one for Gus. In Barry's presentation, he referred to a CSIRO study, but I didn't see, which talked about different energy alternative sources, but didn't, as I saw it, deal with efficiency as a way of reducing energy demand. And in terms of Gus's presentation, he talked about the scale efficiencies associated with energy technologies. There are, of course, negative economies of scale. And there is also a social negative economy, or issue rather, namely that if you have large corporations which are necessary for large sources, then you give them political power. And our present dilemma over the response to climate change is at least largely a political issue associated with the power of corporations. I'd leave it to you to discuss.
Either of you would like to comment on the political influences and the like? Gus.
Well, maybe on the second question first. I guess I think there certainly is a growing trend for increasing diversification of energy systems as well as the retention of the large-scale systems. So, of course, you know, we're getting a lot of distributed networks, distributed energy systems, which are happening in parallel with the large-scale systems. What we're seeing is a much bigger growth in diversity and intercoupling of our energy systems. So whereas traditionally we've had, for example, electrical network on the one hand, gas-powered networks or gas transport systems on the other hand, and transport as relatively separate systems. What we're seeing in the future is a trend towards a much more greater coupling and integration of these systems. We talked about, someone mentioned electrical vehicles early on. Obviously electrical vehicles, if you have batteries in them, can be used as part of energy storage system. But likewise, we're seeing a coupling increasingly of, for example, the gas networks. We're envisaging either being able to generate renewable methane from wind-powered technology via hydrogen, or potentially of taking CO2 that may be captured from another source, reacting that in solar reactors to generate another fuel. So the growth of large-scale systems and increasing coupling between them is part of the mix. But on top of that, we are seeing, as you point out, a growth of more diversified, smaller-scale systems as well. And I don't think we're likely to see, whilst there is a very big growth in distributed networks, I don't think that's going to displace the large scale, the networks certainly for the foreseeable future.
I could see some hands rising, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I do invite you, however, to approach any of our panellists after the session to continue discussions, and I hand over to Mike to conclude proceedings.